So this week's deep dive is going to be a little different. Someone, one of our listeners actually sent us this pretty fascinating historical puzzle. And we were super excited to dig into it.
Yeah.
It's all centered on this ancient fragmented manuscript. It's called the Mondsee Matthew Gospel.
Oh, cool.
And so just even picturing a text that's over 1,000 years old,
Wow.
gets you thinking about the hands that touched it and the stories it holds.
Yes.
But what we found digging into this is way more than just old paper and ink,
Oh, yeah.
It's almost like we get to eavesdrop on the minds of
Yeah.
people from a completely different era.
It really is like stepping back in time.
Yeah.
This deep dive is centered on the Mondsee Matthew Gospel. It was created around 810 AD in the monastic community of Mondsee. So, yeah, a monastery in present-day Austria. And the sources that you shared, from our listener have been so valuable in allowing us to really kind of unpack both the content of this manuscript and the context of its very existence.
Yeah. And what's so cool is right off the bat, how this gospel is put together, the structure of it.
Right.
So imagine a book where you open it up and one page is the Latin text of Matthew, right? The language of scholarship at the church at the time. That's how they recorded everything important.
Of course.
But then you flip the page over and bam, there it is again. But this time it's translated into Old High German.
Wow.
Which is the language that, regular people in that region would have actually spoken.
Yeah, that's amazing. Like a built-in translation guide.
It is. It's like a 9th century translation guide.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's really cool. And we're not talking about some loosey-goosey interpretation here.
No, definitely not.
The Old High German version sticks incredibly close to the Latin, almost word for word in places.
That's dedication.
Yeah. And you can even see how the fancy initial capital letters, the ones that use to start sections,
right,
often line up between the Latin and the German. So it's visually, too, they're trying to mirror each other.
Yeah, very intentional.
Yeah. There are some tiny differences. Sometimes the Old High German initials are indented slightly. But overall, it's really remarkable how dedicated they were to, mirroring the original as closely as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, so to, really wrap our heads around this, we need to take a trip back in time, set the stage.
Time travel.
Yeah. So we're talking the early Middle Ages here. Think about it. The dust has settled after those massive migrations. You've got these pieces of the old Roman Empire still hanging around.
Right.
And then you've got this relatively new force, Christianity, which is spreading like wildfire and shaping everything.
It's huge changes happening.
Yeah, massive cultural shifts. And our expert here can tell us a bit more about the specific time period when this gospel was created.
Yeah, so we're looking at the late 8th and early 9th centuries. This was a time when, Christianity was really consolidating its power, especially in Central Europe. And it's during this period that the Mondsee Matthew Gospel really takes on this immense importance, right? It stands as one of the earliest written examples we have of the German language, period.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, it really is.
And not just any early German. We're talking Old High German, the linguistic ancestor of what we're speaking right now.
Right here, right now.
Yeah.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. It really is. But what makes this even more special is that it's, as far as we know, the first time anyone tried to translate a biblical text from Latin into Old High German.
And it wasn't even the whole Bible, right?
Yeah, it was just this part of Matthew, but still.
Huge deal.
Yeah, it's like a window into how they thought about sharing these sacred texts with a wider audience.
Exactly. Making it accessible, to people who didn't necessarily have the fancy Latin education.
And, what's really compelling is that even though we only have fragments of this gospel left, it's still an invaluable piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding how the German language developed, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's this direct line back to how people in that time and place express themselves, their thoughts, their beliefs, their everyday lives.
It's like having a conversation with them through the words on the page.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, of course, we couldn't resist diving into the nitty-gritty,
No, of course not. That's the best part.
Yeah. We had to look at some specific passages and try to tease out the details.
Right.
And one that really jumped out at us was from Matthew chapters 8 and 9, where Jesus is performing all these incredible miracles in Galilee.
Ah, the miracle.
Yeah, casting demons out into pigs.
Yeah.
Healing a paralyzed man. The kind of stories that would have had people on the edge of their seats.
Oh, absolutely. It's high drama.
It is. It really is. And our expert here, they actually point out this really cool passage
Yeah, so Matthew 8.33 through 9.9, this section offers this really vivid glimpse into Jesus' ministry. And when we look at the Old High German translation, what's striking is it's like almost extreme literalness.
Yeah.
It gives us this unique perspective on the language and its raw form.
Yeah. And like one example is how they translated the part where Jesus gets into a boat.
Right. So in Old High German, it's enti jenk in Sephilin ubar ferita.
Try saying that 3 times fast.
Yeah, right. But if we break it down word for word, it's literally enmity into little ship over across the...
It's like they just grabbed the closest German word for each Latin word and kind of like, strung them together.
Yeah, it's not exactly elegant, but it gets the point across.
Yeah, it's very functional.
Yeah.
And like another example is when they bring the paralytic man to Jesus.
Oh, yeah, powerful imagery.
The text says, "Enti si sarbutun imo before a laman licken."
It sounds so different.
Right. And that translates to, "And see there brought to him before lame lying." You could really see the difference in word order and the vocabulary they used.
Yeah.
Like we wouldn't say lame lying today, but that's how they expressed it back then.
It's fascinating to see how they constructed sentences.
It is. So the main takeaway here, even if you're not a linguist, is that this translation was incredibly literal.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't trying to paraphrase or make it flow nicely.
Oh.
It was like a word-for-word mirror image of the Latin.
Like a linguistic blueprint.
Yeah, exactly. And then, we started thinking about the people who would have been listening to this back then, right?
Right.
Even in a monastery, which was kind of like its own little world.
Yeah.
These stories of faith, of good versus evil, of community coming together, they would have resonated really deeply.
Like, absolutely.
Like they mirrored the very themes that were present in these miracle narratives.
Yeah, it's all about connecting with the audience, right? Making these stories relevant to their lives.
Exactly. So let's shift gears a bit now and talk about how the Mondsee Matthew Gospel gives us these cool little glimpses into how our language has evolved over time.
Linguistic time travel.
Yeah. And this is where things got really exciting, like light bulb moments.
Oh, tell me more.
So you pointed out the old High German word manum, which, basically means men or men.
Mm-hmm.
But as you explained, it originally had this broader gender-neutral meaning of just human being.
Right, like a more inclusive sense of the word man.
Yeah. And you brought up this other source, the vocabulary as sanctigali.
Oh, yeah, that's a fun one.
Which is like a dictionary from around the same time period.
Like a medieval dictionary.
Yeah. And it shows that the Latin word homo, which means man, was translated as man in Old High German.
So there's a clear connection there.
Yeah. And that original meaning of man as just a person, not necessarily male, it's still with us today.
Really? How so?
Like in the modern German pronoun man.
Ah, interesting.
Like when you say, man weiß das doch genau, one knows that for sure in English.
I see. So it's that impersonal one we sometimes use.
Exactly. And what's even cooler is that this connects to the French word homme as well.
Oh, wow. French, too.
Yeah, which also comes from the Latin homo.
Fascinating. So we've got German, French, and Latin all tied together.
All through this one little word, man.
So what does that tell us?
Well, it's like a little window into how they thought about gender back then, right?
Right.
Like their concept of person wasn't necessarily tied to male or female in the same way it often is today.
That's a really important point.
It is. It's one of those tiny linguistic clues that can unlock a bigger understanding of their social structures.
I love those aha moments.
Me too. And speaking of aha moments, you also pointed out something super cool about how they wrote the language.
Oh, yes, the little H with the tilde.
Yeah. It looked like a fancy Z.
It does. It's kind of cute.
But it's not just decoration, right?
No, not at all. This is what we call a Verkürzungsstrich, which is basically a type of abbreviation mark.
Like shorthand for the 9th century.
Exactly. Think of it like a medieval version of our abbreviations, like using etc. or writing someone's initials instead of their full name.
Oh, I see. So why did they do that?
Well, back then, parchment was expensive and writing was super time-consuming.
Right.
So they developed all sorts of ways to save space and write faster. It was all about efficiency.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And this little H with the tilde was one of their clever tricks.
So what does it stand for?
Well, it depended on the context, but it could represent certain sounds or syllables that occurred frequently.
Like a code.
Kind of.
Yeah.
And it's linked to this fascinating shorthand system called the Tyronic shorthand.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it was actually developed by Cicero's secretary Tiro way back in Roman times.
Wow. That's ancient.
It is. But it was still being used in the 9th century, which shows how influential it was. They had all these special symbols to represent words and phrases, making writing much faster.
So even these tiny little marks can tell us so much about the history of writing, you know?
Absolutely. They're like little time capsules preserving the techniques and challenges of a bygone era.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into some more specific words and phrases now. You pointed out this greeting, Friede sei diesem Haus, peace be to this house, from Matthew 10:12.
Yeah.
What can we learn from that?
Well, first of all, it's super direct, right?
Yeah, no beating around the bush.
Friede sei diesem Haus, boom, there it is.
Peace to your house.
Exactly. It's a straightforward wish for peace upon a household. And this highlights the importance of greetings and hospitality in that period.
Right.
It mirrors the biblical emphasis on extending peace to others.
Treating everyone with respect, even strangers.
Yeah. And the fact that this greeting is so prominent in the Mondsee Matthew Gospel suggests that it wasn't just a formality. You know, it points to a society where those basic human interactions, like how you greet someone, carried real weight.
Yeah, like they mattered. They weren't just empty words.
Exactly. It's a glimpse into their social norms and values.
I like that, a glimpse into their value.
Yeah. And then there's the fascinating story behind our modern German negation words, you know, like nein, nie, nicht.
Yeah. They all start with N. Is that a coincidence?
Not at all. It's not a coincidence. They all trace their roots back to this really ancient Proto-Indo-European particle, nie, which basically meant no or not. And in older Germanic languages, including Old High German, where it appeared as nie, it was actually a separate word.
Interesting.
Yeah. So imagine saying nie ein instead of nein, not one.
Right.
And over time, particularly in Middle High German, this no went through a process called univerbation.
Big word.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, but basically it means that it merged with other words to form the negative terms we know today.
So like ne and ein became nein, ne and you became nie.
That's amazing. Yeah. Exactly. And nicht and nichts came from ne and wait, which meant not a thing. So you can see how these tiny linguistic building blocks kind of like, you know, snap together over centuries to create the words we use today.
That's so cool. It's like language is this ever-evolving puzzle, you know?
It really is. And another word that really caught my eye was the Old High German verb raufen, which means to pluck or to tear. It's used in the passage where the disciples are hungry and they pluck grain in Matthew 12:2.
Right. They're getting a little snack.
Yeah, they were hungry. And the Old High German phrase is really vivid. Sin ungirun oarun hungrig, bigunnen raufen du aharenti eson. His disciples also were hungry, began to pluck the ears and eat. The verb raufen really captures that physical act of tearing off the grain.
Yeah, it's very visceral, you know, like you can almost picture them doing it.
Exactly. And it points to a world where basic sustenance, like getting food, often involved this kind of direct physical effort.
Right. No grocery stores back then.
Definitely not. And we have Hort, Old High German for treasure, which might seem like a simple word, but it's actually really interesting because it has survived in modern German in unexpected ways.
Like how?
Well, we still have the verb horten, which means to hoard, right? And then there's hort, which refers to a daycare center.
A daycare. How did treasure become daycare?
It's a fascinating journey. So originally, hort simply meant a collection of valuable things, a treasure.
Right, like golden jewels.
Yeah. But while it was mostly replaced by Schatz in Middle High German for the meaning of treasure, Hort hung on in certain contexts.
Yep.
Like Horten still carries that sense of gathering and keeping things safe.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And the connection to Hort, meaning daycare, might seem less obvious at first, but think about it. It's a protected place where children, a community's treasure, are gathered and looked after.
Oh, I see. It's like the treasure is the children.
Exactly. And it shows how words can take these unexpected twists and turns through time while still holding on to echoes of their original meaning.
That's amazing. It's like these words are carrying their history with them.
They really are. And speaking of word history, let's talk about the verb sprechen, to speak. It's a classic West Germanic word.
West Germanic, what's that?
So the Germanic languages are divided into three main branches: West Germanic, North Germanic, and East Germanic. And sprechen is characteristic of the West Germanic branch, which includes languages like English, German, Dutch, and Frisian.
So sprechen wasn't originally found in, say, the Scandinavian languages.
No, not in its original form. We can reconstruct the Proto-West Germanic form as sprechen, and you can see how it evolved into Old Saxon sprechen, Old English sprechen, Old Frisian spreche, and our Old High German sprechen.
It's cool how you can see the similarities, even though they're different languages.
Yeah, it's like tracing their family tree.
Exactly. And, fun fact, there was actually a variant in Old High German without the R sound spickhan,
Interesting.
which is also found in Old English as spickhan.
So that's where our modern English word speak comes from.
Bingo. Without the R.
It's like English took a slightly different path.
Yeah, while the other West Germanic languages like Standard German sprechen, Dutch sprechen, and West Frisian sprech all kept the R.
Exactly. It shows how even within closely related languages, those tiny phonetic changes can lead to different forms over time.
It's like evolution, but for language.
Exactly. And speaking of little details, you also pointed out something interesting about the verb habet in the phrase ein Mann der ein Schaf habet, a man who a sheep has.
Right.
It's just a small grammatical observation, but that third person singular present tense ending et is typical of Old High German verb conjugation.
Okay.
It's not something we'd think twice about today, but it's a little snapshot of how the language structured its verbs back
I
then.
love those little snapshots. They're so revealing.
Me too. And finally, something that you might never have even considered. The lack of dots on the letter I in the 9th century.
What? No dots on the I? How do they even read?
I know. It's mind-blowing, right? But it makes sense when you think about it. In the 9th century, handwriting wasn't as standardized as it became later.
Okay.
So in manuscripts from that time, you often see the letter I written without a dot because the writing styles of the era didn't necessarily need that extra mark for clarity.
Interesting.
Yeah. It wasn't until the invention of the printing press, with its emphasis on uniformity and readability, that those distinguishing marks, what we call titles, became standard.
So even something as tiny as the dot on an I has its own history.
It really does. Every little mark, every letter, every word, they all have a story to tell.
That's so cool. Okay, let's shift gears again now and talk about how the Mondsee Matthew Gospel reflects faith and interpretation in the early Middle Ages.
Yeah, let's dive into the religious side of things.
You highlighted some really interesting passages about Jesus' teachings on the Sabbath in Matthew chapter 12.
Oh yeah, the Sabbath was a big deal back then.
It was. And one phrase that really stood out was, Merosit hier dan temple. More is here than the temple.
Ugh.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement.
It is. It's from Matthew 12.6, where Jesus is kind of challenging the traditional view of the temple.
Right, he's saying that something even greater is present.
Yeah. And the Mondsee translation of this phrase really makes you think about how people were understanding religious authority at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like Jesus is presenting himself as something that transcends the physical temple, which was like the ultimate symbol of religious power back then.
Yeah, that's a bold claim. And you can imagine how this would have sparked all sorts of questions and debates among the people who heard it.
Totally. Like, where does true authority lie? Is it in a building or in a person?
Right. It's challenging the status quo, forcing them to rethink their beliefs.
And you also mentioned this really interesting concept of arm hairs and will mercy versus sacrifice. Oh, yes. This comes from Matthew 12.7, where Jesus says, Ibu ir aruistirhuas istor hartsen, ibu antinales gelstar. Neoniga shadotot ir dem unskolum. If you also knew what is mercy will and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. It's a pretty complex sentence, but the main idea is that true piety is about inner compassion and genuine intention, not just blindly following rituals.
Yeah, it's about the heart, not just the actions.
Exactly. And this emphasis on mercy and compassion is a recurring theme in Jesus' teachings.
Right. And then there's this other phrase, Trutin is goiso manes sunu iorestidaga. Lord is certainly man's son, also Sabbath of. That word order looks so different from how we'd say it today.
It does, doesn't it? Old High German had a more flexible word order compared to modern German.
Okay.
So the placement of verbs in other parts of the sentence wasn't as fixed, and restidaga literally translates to rest day of, which shows a slightly different way of expressing possession.
So the Sabbath is the day of rest.
Exactly. It's just a different way of phrasing it, but it highlights the grammatical variations between Old High German and modern German.
Cool. And then there's the story of Jesus healing the man with a withered hand, and the question that comes up. Muos man willet to one, must man good do, even on the Sabbath?
This is one of those timeless ethical dilemmas, right?
It is. It's about the conflict between following the rules and doing what's right.
Yeah, and Jesus is challenging the rigid interpretation of Sabbath law by performing this act of healing.
He's putting human need and compassion above strict adherence to the rules.
Exactly. And the way the question is phrased in the Mondsee Matthew Gospel is really interesting. Muus manuela to one, must one do good? It's so direct and powerful.
Yeah, it really cuts to the core of the issue.
And then there's the word gawiso, certainly, which has this cool little adverbial ending.
Okay, tell me more.
So in Old High German, they often added o to adjectives to make them adverbs.
Like how we add "oh, Whitley" in English.
Exactly. So certain becomes certainly, gawi becomes gawiso. It's just a little linguistic quirk, but it helps us understand how the language worked back then.
Those quirks are what make historical linguistics so fascinating, you know?
Absolutely. And you also made this really interesting connection between lesson to read and Ostley's selection discernment.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking about how they viewed knowledge back then.
Right, like what did it mean to read something?
Yeah, and it seems like it wasn't just about decoding the words, but also about actively engaging with the text, making choices about what to focus on and how to interpret it.
Like a process of filtering and understanding, not just passive consumption.
Exactly. And you even link this to the seemingly nonsensical rhyme, literum larum,
Oh yeah, that's a fun one.
where the act of interacting with a text could have been seen as a way to auslesen, to select or recognize knowledge.
It's like they're saying, look closer, there's more here than meets the eye.
I love that interpretation. It really adds a whole new layer of meaning to something that seems like just a silly rhyme.
And of course, we can't forget about Jesus' statement that a kingdom divided cannot stand a concept that feels just as relevant today as it was back then.
So true. Human nature hasn't changed that much.
No, it hasn't. And the Mondsee Matthew Gospel preserves this enduring truth in Old High German, reminding us of its timeless wisdom.
It's amazing how these ancient texts can still speak to us across the centuries.
It really is.
Yeah.
And then we have the sign of Jonah and the comparison of Jesus' time in the Hurdahrú Heart's Sorrowworth's pit to Jonah's time in the whale.
Ah, yes, the Betty of the Beast.
Exactly. This analogy is all about death and resurrection.
Right.
Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the whale before being spit out, a symbol of death and rebirth.
Yeah.
And the Hurdahrú is a really poetic way of describing the depths that Jesus would descend to.
It's like a metaphorical pit of sorrow.
Yeah, and it mirrors Jonah's experience, foreshadowing Jesus' own death and resurrection.
It's a powerful image. And you also pointed out the contrast between the reactions to Jonah's preaching by the Ninevites and the lack of repentance by Jesus' own contemporaries.
Yeah, it's a stark comparison.
The Ninevites, who were considered pagans, repented when Jonah preached to them.
Right.
But many of Jesus' own people who had witnessed his miracles and heard his teachings didn't believe in him.
It highlights this tragic irony.
Yeah. And then there's the figure of the Königin Sundan, Queen of the South, and Solomon.
Oh yeah, they're presented as these examples of wisdom.
Right, they traveled great distances to seek knowledge and truth.
And it's implied that they were wiser than many of the people who were actually living in Jesus' time.
It's a subtle critique, right?
Definitely. It's saying, look, even these outsiders were willing to go to great lengths for wisdom, but you who are right here are missing the point.
It's a challenge to open their eyes and see what's right in front of them.
And then we have the parable of the unclean spirit returning with 7 others. That's a pretty scary story.
It is. It's like a warning about what happens when you leave a void in your life.
Yeah, if you don't fill that void with something good, something worse might take its place.
It's a reminder to be vigilant, to actively cultivate goodness in our lives.
Exactly. And then there's Jesus' statement about his true family being those who do the will of his Father.
Ah, yes, that's a really important one.
It's about redefining what it means to be related.
Right. It's not just about blood ties.
No, it's about a spiritual kinship, a bond created through shared faith and obedience.
It's like building a community based on something deeper than just biology.
Exactly. And then we move into the parables in Matthew 13, the sower, the weeds among the wheat, and so on.
Oh, yeah, the parables. They're so full of imagery and symbolism.
And they're all beautifully preserved in the Mondsee Matthew Gospel, giving us this amazing glimpse into how these stories were told and understood in the early Middle Ages.
Right. And the parable of the sower, with the seeds falling on different types of ground.
That's such a powerful metaphor for how people respond to God's message.
Yeah, some people are like the hard ground. The seed can't take root.
Others are like the thorny ground where the cares of the world choke out the word.
And then there are those who are like the good soil, where the seed grows and bears fruit.
It's a reminder that we all have different capacities for receiving and nurturing faith.
And you also talked about the explanation of why Jesus taught in parables in the first place.
Oh, yeah. That's from Matthew 13.10-17. It's a bit of a mind bender, but basically Jesus is saying that he speaks in parables to both reveal and conceal truth.
How does that work?
Well, it's about fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
There's a prophecy from Isaiah that talks about people hearing without understanding and seeing without perceiving.
Okay.
And Jesus is saying that his parables are fulfilling that prophecy. To those who are willing to listen and seek understanding, the truth is revealed.
But to those who are closed off, the parables remain obscure.
Exactly. And that leads us to the parable of the weeds among the wheat, which talks about the final judgment and the separation of the righteous from the wicked at the ante ueralti end of the world.
It's a pretty intense image.
It is. And remember how we talked about ueralti earlier?
Yeah, man's age or era.
Exactly. It comes from those old roots where man and old goldage. So the end of the world is literally the end of man's age.
It's a cool linguistic connection. And then we have the parables of the treasure hidden in the field and the pearl of great price.
Ah, yes. These are about the immense value of the kingdom of heaven.
They're saying that it's worth sacrificing everything for.
And the old High German words they use are so evocative.
Like what?
Well, teuer means precious or valuable, and le means embodying or possessing. So ein teuer imav greos, a precious embodying pearl or a pearl of great value.
It's a beautiful image.
And then there's the parable of the fishing net, where the good fish are separated from the bad.
Another analogy for that final judgment.
Exactly. And finally, we have Jesus's analogy of the learned scribe as a householder who brings out both old and new treasures.
It's like saying that tradition and innovation are both important.
Yeah, you need to know your roots, but you also need to be open to new ideas.
It's a message that's still relevant today. And you mentioned this phrase, zano ga grim, gnashing of teeth. What's that all about?
Zano ga grim, gnashing of teeth. It appears in a few different places in the Bible.
Okay.
And it's often associated with anger, pain, and bitterness. It's a really vivid image.
Yeah, you can almost hear it.
And it's not just a biblical thing either. It pops up in all sorts of cultures as a way of expressing intense negative emotions.
Interesting. So it's like a universal symbol?
Kind of. And lastly, we have the word trutnen Lord.
Ah, yes, the big one.
It's used for both Jesus and Jehovah in the Mondsee Matthew Gospel.
Right.
And it's interesting because it literally means the true one or the